What's up everyone, I'm Jacob, also known as Jonesy, and in this video, I'm going to be going over the deck for my latest nostalgix deck, which I call Null and Void Value Town. But before I go over the list, if you have not subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and hit the bell to be notified every time I put out a new video. So this past week in the nostalgix Discord, we did not have a webcam tournament. Instead, we had a tournament on Tabletop Simulator, and because of that, there were two heroes I was worried about playing against. The first one was the secret rare in a Harmonic Surge, the Atomic Frog, which lets you play fighters from your void. Unfortunately for me, it turns out you can't actually add the Atomic Frog yet to the nostalgix mod in Tabletop Simulator, so I didn't actually have to worry about it. But the other hero I was worried about, which I did end up facing, was Brecon. A few weeks ago in a webcam tournament, I lost playing against a Brecon Value Town deck made by Elusive. I was worried about people playing decks similar to that, but I found an answer to slow down Brecon. That answer is the Arena Nullifying Void. This is a 3-mana arena, and when it's in play, neither player can use fighter or hero abilities, and all abilities of fighters in play are negated. So with Nullifying Void in play, not only will Brecon be unable to make extra mana, but all abilities given to fighters by any effect or type of card will be negated as well. Now, as good as Nullifying Void is, it also takes away our fighters' abilities, because unlike Destructa, Nullifying Void is not one-sided, it affects everyone. So, in order for us to win with Nullifying Void, we're going to have to get on board quickly and get a fast start. And in order to do that, we are playing Brecon ourselves. The extra mana that Brecon makes is extremely powerful, and with Harmonic Surge giving us some great 2-mana fighters, Brecon is definitely the best hero in the format right now. Now before I go over the rest of the deck, I need to give a big shout out to Elusive because his Value Town deck was the main inspiration for this deck. I also need to give a big shout out to one of the other members of the Discord, Shadow Fiend, because I did some playtesting with him with his deck before the TTS tournament. And funny enough, Shadow Fiend and I actually played against one another in the TTS tournament in a very epic match, so stay tuned for that video. Now as for the fighters in this deck, the best fighter in the deck is definitely Bullfrog. This is a 2-mana fighter with 2 health and 2 armor. It has a 5 damage attack, but its ability says Bullfrog cannot attack 2 turns in a row. But the thing is, with Nullifying Void in play, that ability restriction is gone. It's negated, so Bullfrog can just attack for 5 every single turn. Unfortunately for us, Bullfrog is basically the only fighter in the game whose ability has a drawback, so all of our other fighters will get worse with Nullifying Void in play. Also, it should be pointed out that Bullfrog is being played in a lot of decks because even if the Nullifying Void is not in play, just being able to attack for 5 every other turn is still very powerful, since 5 damage is a lot. So we do have to worry about our opponent's Bullfrogs too before we play our Nullifying Void. Now as for the other fighters, we are playing 2 copies of Sarah. It's a 2-mana fighter with 4 health. It has a 2 damage attack which restores 2 health to any fighter. Lucky for us, this effect will still work underneath the Nullifying Void. Its enter play ability, however, of restoring 2 health to your hero will not work, but in the early turns, we're almost always going to be using Brecon's ability to get ahead of our opponent. So the health restored to our hero will help a little bit in the early game. Next up, we are playing 2 copies of Lunarva. This is another 2-mana, 4 health fighter. It has a 2 damage attack, which can potentially deal 3 more damage if we reveal a surprise from our opponent's hand. It also has an enter play ability, which bounces the surprise your opponent has in play back to their hand. It's not the most useful ability for us, since our opponents in the early game aren't likely to play as many surprises as later in the game, when we will have the Nullifying Void in play, but it is still nice. Next up, we have the last 2-mana fighter in the deck. We have 2 copies of Afri. It has 3 health and 2 damage attack, but its ability is extremely powerful. Once per turn, you can discard a card to give another fighter charge. Even though this is negated by Nullifying Void, it is so powerful, I still felt like it was worth playing 2 copies just to get ahead before we play our Nullifying Void. Next up, we're playing 4 copies of Kai. This is a 3-mana, 5 health fighter with a 3 damage attack, but its ability lets you play it as a +4 attack equipment. Now currently, the ruling between Kai and Nullifying Void is that if a Kai is already in play as an equipment, it stays in play. But any future Kais cannot be played as an equipment, which means that if we play Kai on Brecon before playing our Nullifying Void, it's going to be very difficult for our opponent to deal with it. Largely because the current main answer to playing a Kai on Brecon is Magnafox. We are also playing 4 copies of this, largely because our opponent is also likely to be playing Kai themselves. Magnafox is a 3-mana fighter with 3 health, and because of its ability, when it comes into play, you can attach any equipment your opponent controls to Magnafox. Which means if you steal a Kai with it, Magnafox will then be attacking for 7 damage. Magnafox also has an extra attack where you destroy any number of equipment attached to it and draw a card for each equipment destroyed. But the thing is, if you're going to be stealing a Kai with it, you're likely going to want to keep the Kai attached to it just so you can attack for 7. Even though Magnafox's ability won't work with Nullifying Void in play, it gives us extra assurance in case our opponent is able to play a Kai themselves before we get our Nullifying Void in play. Next up, we're playing 4 copies of Succubi. This is a 3 mana 6 health fighter with a 2 damage attack, which isn't a lot, but its attack has the effect where opponent discards a card from their hand. The discard does make our Lunarvas worse, but it works very well with our Nullifying Void plan by limiting our opponent's resources and cards. Plus, with 6 health, Succubi can survive 1 attack from a Brecon with Kai, and 1 attack from a Bullfrog. Next up, we have 3 copies of Fish Out of Water, which is definitely a staple in nostalgix. For 4 mana, it is immune to binding, comes in with 7 health, has a 6 damage attack, and instead of using that 6 damage breakout attack, you can instead remove the weakness from one of your fighters and make that fighter immune to binding. Even though Fish Out of Water's immune to binding ability and attack effect are both negated by Nullifying Void, it still attacks with 6 damage, which makes it definitely worth it in this deck. Lastly, for the fighters, we have 3 copies of Gundra. This is a 4 mana fighter with 7 health. Its 4 damage attack also has the effect of dealing 2 damage to another opponent's fighter, which still works under Nullifying Void. So Gundra is very useful at clearing out your opponent's side of the field and spreading out damage. Now onto the spells, we're playing 2 copies of Alternate Timeline. This is a 1 mana spell which lets you look at the top 2 cards of the deck, you draw 1, and you void the other. Alternate Timeline's card filtering effect is very powerful, and because it only costs 1 mana, it's definitely worth playing a couple copies. Next up, we have 3 copies of Shames of the Deep, another staple in the format. For 2 mana, it deals 2 damage to any fighter, and it binds it. So even if you can't kill a fighter with it, it will still buy you time thanks to the binding. Next up, we have 3 copies of Souljar Dice. For 5 mana, you roll a d10, and you deal that much damage to each of up to 2 enemy fighters. Now while this does seem like a very big hit or miss card, and the misses do happen sometimes, the thing is, you can roll the die and then choose which enemy fighters to target with it afterwards. Which does make low rolls a little more useful, and even without that stipulation, Souljar Dice would still absolutely be worth it, just because of the high impact potential with it. Lastly, for the spells, we're playing 2 copies of Energy Drink. For 2 mana, it gives the fighter charge and you draw a card. With a Nullifying Void in play, the charge is negated, so it's basically just a 2 mana cantrip, but I still felt like 2 copies of this would be better than the 3rd and 4th copies of Afri. Lastly, for the surprises, we have a pretty standard lineup. We have 2 copies of Saving Grace, which can save one of our fighters at 1 health and make them immune to everything until the next turn, if our fighter would be destroyed by damage. We have 2 copies of Nope to counter any spells, and we have 2 copies of Reverse to negate surprises. Now on to the sideboard. I did end up putting the 3rd and 4th copies of Afri in the sideboard, just in case I faced any decks where Nullifying Void didn't actually slow them down a lot. So my plan for those decks was to just board out the Nullifying Voids and put in the extra Afris just so I can be more aggressive. Now for equipment, I played 2 copies of Dancing Shoes. For 1 mana, you can make the equipped fighter or hero immune to binding. Even though this is negated from a Nullifying Void, Change the Deep is a very popular card, and there are a lot of other random cards which cause binding too. So I felt like 2 copies would be worth it for the early game. Onto the spells, we're also playing 1 copy of Flash Mob. For 2 mana, it makes all of your fighters immune to binding until the start of your next turn. Even though this costs more mana than Dancing Shoes, and the immunity to binding only lasts for 1 turn, it applies to all of your fighters, not just 1. So I felt like having 1 copy of Flash Mob would be better than a 3rd copy of Dancing Shoes. Our second spell is Costume Change. For 3 mana, it lets you re-equip all of your equipment in play in any way you want. Costume changes are answered to our opponent's Magnafoxes, because when a Magnafox steals an equipment, your equipment stays on your side of the field, which means that you still technically control that equipment. Lastly in the sideboard, we have 4 more surprises. We have 2 copies of Dance Fatigue. For 2 mana, you bind everything that attacked this turn. Even though Harmonic Surge gave us more ways to make things immune to binding, I still felt like having 2 more cards which could bind our opponent's fighters would be worth it just in case. Lastly, in case we face any spell-heavy decks, we also have a 3rd copy of Nope and 1 copy of Mixtape. And that is my Null and Void deck. What do you think about it? Let me know in the comments down below. Thanks so much for watching everyone, and I will see you in the next video.